All right, Ryan here with longrangeonly.com, and in this video we're going to talk about the optimal charge weight load development method, or as you would see it often on the internet, the OCW. Now, you can Google Dan Newberry, who is the guy credited for coming up with this load development. I think, like many of these types of things, probably numerous people were actually doing it. He's the one that has a lot of data on the internet out there, and I don't do mine exactly like he prescribes, and I've got it narrowed down to a way that I think works better and doesn't interfere with the results like the other method. Not that it's bad, and the overall point is the exact same between the two methods. So real quickly up front, I'm going to talk about a couple different ways to actually get started with it. Now, whereas a ladder test where we shoot at long distance, I have found that seating depth doesn't have a large effect on finding the node. So you can actually go out and shoot your powder charge ladder test and not worry too much about it. Now I have, and so on ladder tests I typically do powder charge and then fine tune with seating depth, because seating depth just doesn't have a huge effect on vertical at long distance like powder charge does. Now it does affect group shape and can affect things like, and does affect things like the horizontal that a lot of people might confuse with wind only. Now, I've experimented quite a bit when I'm doing my optimal charge weights with which works best, seating depth first or seating depth after, and you're kind of in a bad spot here while picking. Doing seating depth testing first does make the optimal charge weight target easier to read, but the problem with seating depth first is if you do seating depth test at the wrong powder charge, quite often it's very difficult to see which one is the best seating depth. And I'll just throw out an example. Let's just take a 300 Win Mag where the most accurate powder charge is at 75 grains of H1000 with a Berger 215. Now, if you were to do seating depth testing at 73.5 or 76 grains of H1000, the groups might all be, 3/4 of an inch to 1 minute, and it's going to be, not every time, but it is going to be often very difficult to pick out which seating depth is the right one. So, if you can do a seating depth test before you do the optimal charge powder test, it will make the results easier to read on the optimal charge weight test. Now, on the flip side of that, if we do the optimal charge weight test first, it will make finding the right seating depth test or the right seating depth a lot easier to read after the fact. But a lot of times when you're at the wrong seating depth with the optimal charge, you get that same effect. The groups really don't change in size, which is not the main goal of this test, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But the point of impact shift is harder to read because the group sizes are the same, and I'll try to demonstrate this on the whiteboard, and then we will look at 2 or 3 different targets and kind of walk through these. They are what I would consider to be normal optimal charge weight targets, so they're going to be about the same difficulty to read as most. In my opinion, this test is a lot more difficult to read than a ladder test. I think a ladder test, especially at 1,000 yards, is a lot easier to pick out the node. So real quickly, what I typically do with a new rifle, and I almost always do with a new, to me, combination, like a new cartridge, a new powder, or a new bullet, is I will do a pressure test where I'll go shoot one of each consecutively increasing powder charge until I hit pressure. I will note the velocities and I will note the point of impact on the target. Then I will take 3 consecutive powder charges where the point of impact was relatively the same. Typically at 100 yards you can get them under a half minute or right at a half minute, and where the velocity increase kind of has a flat spot. And in a separate video I'll talk about why that alone without the target is almost worthless and realistically just guessing. Like I just said, I'll talk about that in a different video, but I want to mention it here in this video. So what I'll do is I'll go shoot and I'll drop in some videos of them, and then I will talk about in this video why you can't just rely on that as a go shoot these 10 shots and we're done. So I'll go shoot like let's just say, so we'll load up 64 to 72 grains of Reloader 26 in a 300 WSM, and I'll go shoot them all, and I'll do this in half grain increments. So let's just say I shoot the 64, and then I shoot the 64 and a half, and then I shoot the 65, and then I shoot the 66, and then I shoot the 66 and a half, then the 67, and then the 67 and a half, 68, then 68 and a half, 69, 69 and a half, 70, 70 and a half, 71, 72. I guess that would be the last one I would shoot in this example. Okay, and then I don't want to waste a bunch of time going over the velocities, but let's say these right here, the velocities were, let's say from the high to the low, the extreme spread was 30 foot per second, which is across the grain is a relatively small change. I would pick the middle charge of this, and that's where I would do seating depth testing. I would also, so that we're clear when I'm doing my pressure test, if we hit signs of pressure, I would stop and I would go back home, pull the bullets, use them for Fowlers later, and dump the powder back in my dispenser or into my my powder container. So with a brand new cartridge, I'll go do one of these. Like I said, I will drop in some pictures and let you look at those to have a better idea, and we'll discuss those. I think, at least the way my brain works, it's easy to see this on a whiteboard, but I will, like I said, do the pictures. Okay, so now I've done this and I picked this center charge here. Now I'll go do a seating depth test, and I only do this typically when I'm going to do an optimal charge weight. If I'm going to do a ladder test, I can do my pressure testing while I'm doing the ladder, and those results just seem to show themselves a little bit better. With this, I have found that doing seating depth testing first just seems to make it easier to read. So typically I'm running about a 50% success rate on that little 3-shot group that I just showed you, being within a grain of the node, and it has helped me get the right seating depth when I do my seating depth test. So I'll take that middle charge that we just talked about, and then I'll go load 3 each at 10 off, 20 thousandths off, 30 thousandths off, 40 thousandths off. And typically I'll get 3/4 of a minute to a minute on most of them, and then one will be like right around a half minute. Maybe it's 6/10 of a minute. It'll be a little bit smaller than the other. And I'm typically looking for a roundish group when I'm doing my seating depth testing. And we'll do a whole video on seating depth testing. That's not the point of this, but I have found, like I said, I've repeated multiple times now, it makes the optimal charge way easier to read. I typically like to see my seating depth group testing to look more like this than this. And I think that's obvious, but a lot of times like this group could be smaller than this. And if I get a group like this, so basically out of these, let's say this was 10 off, this was 20 off, this was 30 off, this was 40 off. Typically I would pick this for my seating depth just because of the group shape. And then I think we can tweak that in with the powder charge using this optimal charge weight method, which is the entire point of this video. But if I get a group like this, and a lot of times like this one may be a little excessive, but if I get a group like this where two are in the same hole and then you've got a flyer, I'll typically come back to this and shoot -35 and -45. A lot of times I'll see that this seating depth testing or seating depth change here will bring that group back into a little tiny group like this. But sometimes it just goes to more like this, where it kind of puts that one that was essentially in the same hole off. But I would focus on this one for an optimal charge weight. Later we can come back and we can recheck this. So to reiterate where we're at now, I've done a pressure test. I found what seems to be somewhat of a node, maybe, potentially, and I've done seating depth testing. So now that's done a multiple things for this. Like I said, through my experience and doing both optimal charge weight without having the correct seating depth and doing it with the correct seating depth, it's a lot easier to read with the correct seating depth. It has also allowed me, that pressure test has allowed me to do an optimal charge weight without going, I think in my example I used 64 to 72 grains. I don't need to go and load up 3 of every single one of these. So I can go to what that was in the middle, and I've already forgotten what it was, but let's just say it was 68.5 and 69 grains. So now I can pick this one here, and we can go we can make smaller increments in our powder changes. We can go 68.2, 68.5, 68.8, 69.1, and 67.9, and so on and so forth. Instead of going clear back to 64 and up to 72, we can kind of lower that window, maybe go another one there, and then 67.6 here. Clean that up. So now we've got 0.3 of a grain increments. I like to do, ultimately, regardless of the powder charge, I like to do 0.3. Sometimes I will, depending on what the bullet and the cost of the components and the time I have and those types of things, once I get over powder capacities of 60 or 70, I'll increase those changes to 0.5 grains. But this method here helps us narrow down the window, so I can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so that'll allow us to shoot 21 shots for our optimal charge weight. So to reiterate again, we'll start with a pressure test, put all those on paper, collect the velocity, and we should see a node. And like I said, I will show you a couple targets where we did that. We'll talk about those, and I've gotten the targets. But I did the pressure test. It allowed me to get in, and then I did a seating depth test at what appeared to be a node. It's not always where the node ends up being when you're done with the optimal charge testing, but it'll be close enough, typically in my experience, to do a seating depth test. So then we went and done a seating depth test, and now we have loaded up 7 different powder charges in 0.3 of a grain increments. Like I said, if we get above 70 grains in powder, typically you can get away with 0.5, but the smaller these increments are, the better off your results are going to be. Obviously, the smaller they are, the more shots you're going to have to shoot to find the node. So it's a pros and a con thing. You have to pick what works for you. Like I said, I typically like 0.3 of a grain. In some of the larger cartridges, like a 338 Terminator, maybe even a 338 Lapua, 338 Edge, you probably want to go to 0.5 grain increments. So now we've loaded all those up, and I'm going to demonstrate on here what we're looking at, what we're looking for, and what we're trying to accomplish. So I'm just going to draw a line across here to kind of demonstrate. And this is going to be exaggerated. These little circles are going to represent our point of aim. Okay, and take some ciders. Ultimately, you do not want your bullets to impact here. That's just the way I feel about any time you're shooting at a target, because you don't want to be disrupting your point of aim. So to exaggerate this, what you're going to see here in some way, shape, form, it could be, I'm not going to mark over a target, but you're going to see your target or your groups oscillate in some kind of wave pattern, whereas one powder charge may be here, the next 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 here. Now, like I said, I have exaggerated this to demonstrate a point. With the right barrel contour, the right bullet, and all that stuff, that wave could be like this. Again, groups, centers impacting here as the powder charge is increased. Okay, and it could be a deal where the wave's like this and it doesn't really affect it much, and I have seen that style of pattern more often personally with big heavy barrels, bull barrels, varmint type barrels, Sendero barrels, stuff like that. But what we're looking for here is, so I only got 6 dots here, but let's go ahead and call this one 68.5 grains, and I'm just going to do this to make it easier on me on the fly here. So I got 67.5, 68, 68.5, 69 grains, 69 and a half, 70 of an imaginary powder with an imaginary bullet. So we'll go shoot these all at these point of aims on, you can do it on a blank piece of paper. You can do it, I use painter's paper that they would use on auto body shop. And then the best way is to do optimal charge weight targets, which I will show you obviously when we look at the targets, and then I'll show you the piece of paper, and I will provide a link to where you can actually get those to do your own optimal charge. But so let's just say this 67.5 looked like this, and then let's say the 68 looked like this, and then the 68.5 looked like this, and the 69 looked like this, the 69 and a half looked like this, and then the 70 looked like this. Now those waves won't necessarily always be consistent on what you see on the target, because you may not have a large enough data group. You may, in order to see that, you may have to load 67 and down and down and down and so forth. I hope that part makes sense. You may have it narrowed down in so much, and realistically that would be perfect. It would be an awesome situation where the point of impact doesn't change much. But in this one, it's obvious. The optimal charge weight target actually kind of helps, because it has boxes. There'd be boxes up here where you can hopefully put the bullets, and then you can do a comparison of point of impact. And what we're looking for here is the fact that these didn't really change much, and especially these didn't change much in where they hit on the target in relationship to the point of aim. If I see something like this, I have 100% confidence that that is going to be a stable load, as stable as it can be for that powder and bullet combination. Now there's a lot of other things that come into play in the actual stability of that load, like the temp stability of the powder and such. So I've gotten to the point where I don't use temp sensitive powders. I use H1000. I've had really good luck with N565. Reloader 26 in my recent testing has been pretty temp stable. The RL23, the RL16 have been proven to be stable. H4350. I think most of you guys know those temp stable powders. The Hodgson Extreme powders, the entire Hodgson Extreme line's temp stable. So what this means is as the conditions change, this load is never going to swing far from the point of impact that we desire. The groups may open a little bit if conditions change, but they're going to continue to hit in the same spot. This is what we want. This is a perfect example of what we're hoping we get on the target. Now I'm going to show you, I'm just going to leave this up here and we're going to draw some stuff down here, and I'm going to show you what we don't want. So I'll kind of try to replicate the same thing here. We'll just use this as the point of aim again. Obviously these little black circles I'm drawing, I hope everyone's on board with me now and understands those are bullet impacts. This does not happen very often, but it does happen. I've seen it. Everyone, without knowing what the optimal charge weight test is and knowing how the load is actually going to respond to changing conditions, and I can tell you it does happen. So everyone's going to want to pick this. They're going to get emotional. They're going to say that's the small group, that's the one I want. It's not. Number one, it probably won't even shoot like that again. It probably will not repeat itself. Number two, even if it does, when the conditions change, I don't care how stable the powder is, even with H1000 or even with H4350, in my experience and my testing, if you get a rifle and a powder bullet combination that does something like this, this will not be stable. This is probably in the top 10, there's no probably, this is in the top 10 of questions I get from people on forums and on the social media platforms. I had a load developed, it was shooting really small, and let's just say we developed that load at 80 degrees, and now I'm out hunting or in hunting conditions at 30 degrees and it won't shoot. I take it out to 800 yards and the groups are just horrible. I can barely hit a 4x4 target. That's why. That's the whole point of this optimal charge weight load development method. Realistically, it's the point of the ladder testing too. So in this example, I wouldn't even run this because the change is so great here, and I wouldn't run this because of the same reason. I would run this, with this being my powder charge, and we could try to tweak seating depth, and we could maybe even split the difference here. At 5/10 of a grain, there's a lot of room here. We could do 68.7 and go see what that shot, and we could do 69.2 and we could go see how that shot. And then you might even be able to tweak, because remember in our seating depth testing, we did 10 thousandths. Now 10 thousandths is too far sometimes. We could go out and pick one of these powder charges here and go whatever seating depth this was, we could go 5 thousandths shorter and we could go 5 thousandths longer and shrink that group. And even if this combination only shoots half minute, I know everyone on the internet wants to shoot those quarter-minute groups, but rifles that we shoot from prone in field positions that weigh under 10 pounds are just not going to consistently shoot quarter-minute groups. You may get a lot of them, but they're not always going to do it. My most accurate rifle shoots a lot of quarter-minute groups, but it won't do it every time. A half-minute load that's stable and is going to stay hitting at the same point on the target when you pull the trigger through a lot of different conditions, that's what we want for hunting. We're not trying to win bench rest competitions here. We're not going to be able to go do sighters. We're not trying to shoot the smallest group for the day. We're trying to put the bullets on the same place on an animal, time in and time out. And this is what the point of this is, and this will do it. You can't get emotional about this. Like I said, this is what we usually get, or something like it. This doesn't happen often, but when it does, you cannot get emotional and pick that. You got to go with something like this. I know it's hard, and a lot of people will go do it, and even if it does repeat, I can guarantee with as much certainty as I can that that's not going to hold up long term. Now, this really covers what the point is, and I think how to do it. I think this is a lot quicker to describe than doing a ladder test, but it's a lot more difficult, I think, to read. So now we've talked about how I get here and the method that we use, and we've pointed out realistically the two different situations. This is where I would tweak. Again, we might be able to try 68.2 on this target and 68.7, and maybe do the same thing here. Add a 5 thousandths seating depth and subtract 5 thousandths seating depth to see if we can tighten that up. But the point is, this is going to give us a stable load. Now, while we're at it real quick, I am going to do a separate video on seating depth testing, but I have not found that the optimal charge weight method works for seating depth. I know that a lot of guys claim that it does, and ultimately it can, and basically what you do is you're doing the exact same thing. You're just, as you change seating depth, you're looking for this type of group change versus this type of group. But with seating depth testing, I've always just picked the most accurate, or if I get acceptable consecutive seating depth groups, I will go with the one that will fall back as the throat wears into one that still shoots well. Again, I don't want to focus on that or dwell on that because we'll talk about it in a separate group. Right. We're going to take a look at the method I use to kind of hone in on the powder charges that I want to do my optimal charge weight in. Like I said in the opening, and I want to reiterate it and make sure it's very clear, you do not have to do this. You can go out and just do the optimal charge weight without doing this pressure test and without doing seating depth test. But this will, even though you're going to shoot 10 to 12 rounds, it will actually make it quicker and allow you to use less components in the end because you don't have to load up 3 at every charge. It kind of allows you to hone in. It doesn't work every time, but we'll look here. It kind of, most of the time it does do a really good job, and in any case it kind of helps you hone in on where you need to start. So in this one here, we can see I loaded up from 65 to 71 grains. This is where I started with the Reloader 26 and a 215 Burger in the 300 WSM. And what I ended up doing was this 68 to 69 grains had a very small dispersion on the target. It also had 68.5 here to 69, had a small ES. Now, I would place more value on the actual point of impact versus the velocity change because I've not seen this be a really good correlation. And like I said, I will do another video on why that is, but I did my seating depth testing at. The final load ended up being 68.7 grains when the optimal charge weight was all said and done. And on the optimal charge weight test on this rifle, you can see that we had a real small group right there. If it was 68.8, just come back in here and show you that 68.8 is where we had, so we honed in really small here and shot that 68.8. So we'll move on to another one. Okay, and this was the pressure test that I did with the same rifle using N565, and we had this 69, 69 and a half, 77 and a half all hit in this little tiny spot right here. And then the velocity, and this is really why I wouldn't use velocity, it didn't really impress me with any flat spots. This final load ended up being 69.5, and that's what it was right here. Again, we honed into a relatively small area so that I didn't have to shoot 3 shots of every shot. So that one kind of helped with that. Here we've got a Reloader 26 with a 156 grain burger in the 6.5 PRC. This one shows us a lot of things. It does help me kind of narrow down, and basically what I did was I threw the ones that were far out, like 54 was out of the group, 59 was out of the group, and then 57 and 57 and a half weren't really in the group. But we ended up, the final load, that was this right here. These are just targets. I could sit here for hours and show you all the shooting we've done with those rifles outside of these, but I'm trying really hard to make this as concise as possible. This target right here is an exact example, in my opinion, of why this won't work in itself, because realistically this target was so the group was so small you couldn't really pick anything out of here. Right? Well, I didn't do any seating depth testing with this one at all, because I already knew that this rifle liked 156 grain burgers 25 thousandths off, and that's one of the reasons why you got that small group there on paper. A lot of times, if you haven't done seating depth testing ahead of time, you won't get those small groups. And we'll go back and look. That realistically, I do these pressure tests, and then I typically do seating depth tests. And like I said, I usually only do these when I'm new to the combo. Like this was my first long-throated 300 WSM using a Reloader 26 with a 215 burger. So I did this pressure test to find the window that I'm in. If I were going to do something like a 300 Win Mag, there's plenty of data out there for H1000 and the 215 burger that I would start in that window that I know works. Okay, and then I typically, and I have found the best results using the optimal charge weight if I do a pressure test first. This one again is the N565 powder in the 300 WSM with a 215 burger. So then we did an optimal charge weight on other sides of this, just like I demonstrated on the whiteboard. And one last time to reiterate, you do not have to do this, and you do not have to do seating depth testing first, but I do find that it speeds up the process. So I told you we would take a look at these pressure tests that I do, and that's what we've got there. So this was just one I put together real quickly for this video, and we used a seating depth test for Burger 156s in a 6.5 PRC that I had already had 2 different loads with, and they both liked 25 thousandths off. So I went ahead and just used that, and we started at 54.9 grains here, and we worked up in 0.3 of a grain increments. So we went to 55.2, and then 55.5, and then 55.8, and then 56.1. These are Reloader 26, and you can see here, this is one of the things that is, this was what I would consider to be probably a standard optimal charge weight target, and you could see how it might be even more difficult to read if we didn't have the right seating depth. But what we're looking at here is the fact that the smallest group here on the lower charge would sit right in here, and then on the upper charge would sit right in here, and then it's starting to actually move away. If we were to shoot this, we might see this start to go up there, but this is a standard optimal charge weight. Now I have a lot of confidence that this would shoot and be stable. So this is the load that I would run in this 55.8 grains of Reloader. 26. It also happened to have an ES of 11, and we will talk about that in future videos. I've not found a direct correlation between tight ES and tight groups at 1,000 yards. It just doesn't matter inside of 1,000 yards the way a lot of people want it to. But in any case, the point of impact didn't change much here, so this is a nice stable load, and it happens to be the smallest group that the combo shot this time. And this is with my 300 WSM. I already have a load with reloader 26, but this is with the 215 Burger. We again just ran the seating depth that it is shooting with the other load, and then we went from 69.2 to 69.5, 69.8, 70.1, and 70.4. And you can see here that these would have impacted right in here, so they would be in the group, probably not as much as I would normally like them to be, and then they would have impacted right here, so they'd be right in the middle of this group. And I know that this is going to be a stable load, and I played with it a little bit more, and I know that that's an accurate load, and it's also stable. This is what we are wanting. So there's another one, and then I'm going to save that target there for when we're done with this. So this was an optimal charge weight I did with my reloader 26 prior to the N565 load. Again, we did this for the purpose of this video because I do currently have access to a longer range, which I would much prefer to do a ladder test. But we started out at 68.6. This one I went in 0.2 of a grain increments, and I went to 68.8, then 69, 69.2, 69.4. And here we can see this point of impact would have been right in between the 68.6 and it would have been right in this area, so it would have been right in between here. So I know that this load is going to be a stable load. We went ahead and shot this some more, and we played with seating depth testing. I'm going to go ahead and show you how this played out, and this is the target that we got. So I cleaned it after we did that optimal charge. We fired these first 3 shots, and this is what I typically see with a clean barrel. That's why I don't ever do any load development on a clean barrel. And then we can see here shots 4, 5, and 6 started to come together. And then we played with 3 different seating depths. So this was, I don't want to get sidetracked because this is not about seating depth, but this one is at 2.414. This one is at 2.424, and then we've got this one up here in the corner at 2.414. And you can see that these all impacted at the same spot. It would have been a 9-shot group, well under half minute, and this was a different seating depth test, or seating depth that obviously the rifle doesn't like, or at least not as much as this. So this was the load that this rifle is going to run, but it kind of shows you what the optimal charge weight is capable of. And if I don't have access to long range, this is the method that I will use. All right, now we have walked through the entire optimal charge weight load development method. We started off with doing the pressure test, which isn't mandatory, but I do recommend it, especially with a new to you combo, a new powder, new bullet. Any of the pieces have changed from what you knew before. It helps you narrow down what you're actually going to use for the optimal charge weight. Once again, it's not mandatory. You can just load up 3 of a bunch of different consecutive powder charges and go shoot the optimal charge weight, and you will be able to use the method to look at the target and see where the stable point of impact is. After I do my pressure test, I look at the target to see what looks like it's probably a node or possibly a node, and then I do seating depth testing, and I do those at 10 off, 20 off, 30 off, 40 off. If none of those are accurate, I will continue on in 10,000 increments. I have not found personally that the Burger 40 thousandths of change has worked for me because you go right over seating depth nodes. A lot of times you do it with 10,000ths of an inch changes. So pressure test, seating depth test, and then I go load up that window in 3 or 5 tenths, and 4 tenths would work fine too. 3 or 5 tenths increment changes, and then I shoot them at the paper, and then I analyze the paper. We looked at those targets, and we analyzed why those loads were going to work. Now in this case, the ones that we looked at, the stable charge was also the most accurate charge, so it made it easy, but we also talked about the pitfalls of choosing the most accurate load when it's not stable, as demonstrated on this whiteboard. So I think that demonstrates the optimal charge weight. One thing I didn't mention up front is we want to do this at 100 yards, and we don't want to do it farther, because the farther you do it, the more difficult it's going to be to read the point of impact, as we want to be able to distinguish the exact point of impact, the center of the group, or I guess the average center of the group. And I think that we covered those on the targets that we looked at. So I would still choose a ladder over the optimal charge weight, because I think it gets you dialed in quicker. It eliminates some of the steps, and it takes less shots on paper. But if you don't have long distance, just go shoot an optimal charge weight at 100 yards, and it will give you a load that is stable through a lot of conditions. And I have yet to find one that didn't hold up long range. We'll have a link to a thread on longrangeonly.com where you can head over. You can ask me any questions. I'll try to get those answered. If there's enough of a specific question or enough questions in relationship to this, I might do a follow-up video if needed. If you're not a member on longrangeonly.com, it's quick, it's free, it's easy to sign up. We would love to have you. There's a lot of information on there, and you don't have to be a member to partake in that information, but you can come in there and ask us questions. It's a great group of guys, and we'll get those answered for you. Please like the video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps us continue to give you this content, and so we would appreciate that. Thank you for watching the video. Have a great day.